Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the world of unbelievable survival stories. Real people who went through situations so extreme, so unimaginable, that even experts were left wondering, how did they make it out alive? These are the kinds of stories that force you to rethink what the human body is capable of, what the human mind can endure, and, most surprisingly, how powerful instinct, luck, and sheer willpower can be when the odds are stacked against you in the worst ways imaginable. Some of these stories come from the frozen depths of nature, others from the skies, from the ocean, from war, from disasters, and from freak accidents that seem statistically impossible. And yet, these people walked, or crawled, away from situations that should have ended them. Their stories aren't just shocking, they're proof that sometimes reality is far more dramatic than any movie script you've ever seen. Let's begin with the incredible story of a woman who found herself literally frozen between life and death. She had been skiing with friends, just enjoying a normal winter day, when one sudden fall trapped her beneath a thick layer of ice in freezing water. She was stuck there for over an hour, breathing only through a tiny pocket of air, as her body temperature plummeted to levels doctors typically label unsurvivable. Most people lose consciousness after only minutes in icy water. Her body, however, entered a state of extreme hypothermia that slowed down her metabolism so drastically that her organs essentially paused. When rescuers finally found her and airlifted her to a hospital, a team of over 100 medical staff worked on her for nearly 9 hours. They warmed her blood, restarted her heart, and waited. 10 days later, she woke up from a coma, alive, with almost no permanent brain damage. Her own doctors said it was the closest thing to being frozen in time. Her survival is still cited in medical journals as one of the most remarkable recoveries in history. From ice to sky. Another unbelievable tale comes from a stewardess whose flight exploded mid-air in the 1970s. The plane was torn apart miles above ground, and she was thrown out of the aircraft without a parachute. She fell more than 10,000 meters before slamming into a forested mountainside. Experts say no one should survive a fall from that height. But trees, branches, and the angle of the mountain somehow softened the impact enough for her to live. Her injuries were catastrophic: broken bones, a fractured skull, temporary paralysis, but she woke weeks later as the sole survivor of the crash. She eventually recovered fully and even entered the Guinness World Records for surviving the highest fall without a parachute. The fact that her heart was still beating after that fall is something even physics can't comfortably explain. Then there is the story of a park ranger who became famous not for his work, but because the sky just couldn't leave him alone. Over the course of his life, he was struck by lightning 7 separate times and survived each one. Once, lightning blew his toenail off. Another time, it burned off his eyebrows. He suffered scorched skin, ruptured eardrums, and countless scars. The strangest part? He wasn't outdoors during every strike. Once he was hit inside his truck. Once he was hit while calmly working. He even started to believe a force was following him, because the strike seemed to find him no matter where he went. Statistically, this should never happen. The odds of being struck once in your lifetime are astronomically low. But 7 times? That number goes beyond science into the realm of something unexplainable. But no story tests the limits of survival quite like the man who was literally sliced in half by a moving train and lived. He worked in a rail yard, lost his footing, and fell beneath a moving train. He was dragged for several meters before the wheels cut his body cleanly in two at the waist. Still conscious, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911 himself. He calmly explained the injury, waited for emergency responders, and stayed awake until they sedated him. Doctors gave him almost no chance of survival. Yet after dozens of surgeries, months of recovery, and an unimaginable amount of pain, he lived. He lost his legs, his kidney, and a substantial amount of blood, but he survived to share his story on television and even returned to work years later. His case remains one of the most medically improbable survivals ever recorded. The next story takes us back to wartime. Imagine being stranded at sea for over a month, 47 days, without food, without shelter, surrounded by sharks, dodging enemy fire, dehydrated, burned by salt water, sun-scorched, and starving. That was the reality for a soldier who crashed into the Pacific during World War II. He floated on a tiny raft, fought off sharks with his bare hands, survived bombings, rationed raindrops, and hallucinated his own death multiple times. When he finally reached land, he thought salvation had arrived. until he realized he had drifted onto enemy territory and was immediately taken prisoner. What followed was years of brutal torture, starvation, and psychological torment. But he lived through it all and eventually returned home, going on to live to the age of 97. His story became the basis for a best-selling book and a Hollywood film, but even those couldn't capture the sheer resilience of his survival. Some survival stories are so visually shocking that people assume they're fake, like the man who smashed through his windshield during a car crash and landed headfirst onto the road, losing a massive portion of his skull. Doctors had to remove bone fragments and parts of his brain just to keep him alive. The accident left him with a collapsed skull that looked almost unreal. Photographs of him circulated online, and many assumed it was Photoshop. But he is real, fully conscious, speaking, living, and functioning despite losing nearly half his head. He was only 14 at the time, and today he works, socializes, and even laughs about how people stare at him. Doctors still can't explain how he maintained cognition with so much brain loss, but he remains one of the most visually unbelievable survivors ever documented. And then there's the climber whose arm was pinned by a massive boulder in a remote canyon. Alone, trapped, dehydrated, and with no chance of rescue, he spent days rationing what little water he had, before realizing his only path to survival was to amputate his own arm using a dull, cheap knife. After the self-amputation, a process so painful and gruesome that most people faint just hearing the description, he still had to rappel down a cliff and walk miles before finding help. He lost over a quarter of his blood, but lived. His original real-life footage eventually went viral, and his story was immortalized in a film that left audiences speechless. Another unbelievable story comes from a teenage girl who survived a plane explosion and a 10,000-foot freefall into a rainforest. She remained strapped to her seat, which acted as a makeshift parachute as it tumbled through the trees. Knocked unconscious, she woke alone, surrounded by jungle creatures and covered in insects burrowing into her wounds. Using survival knowledge her father had taught her, she treated herself with gasoline from the wreckage, burning out the maggots. She then trekked for days through the Amazon rainforest, following a stream until she finally reached a village. She was the only survivor of the crash. Investigators later discovered her mother initially survived the fall as well, but died waiting for rescue. The girl's survival remains one of the most astonishing in aviation history. We then look at a man who survived a firing squad, 9 bullets, including 1 shot directly to the head. Soldiers aimed for his vital organs, and after the first volley, he collapsed. A final bullet was fired at close range to ensure death. But, incredibly, he remained alive. And while the soldiers were distracted, he escaped. He lived for decades afterward, eventually traveling the world, sharing his story. Photographs taken years later show him smiling calmly, a visible bullet wound still marking his forehead. And then comes the man who may be the luckiest, or unluckiest, person to ever live. Over the course of his life, he survived a train derailment into icy water, an airplane explosion that ejected him into a haystack, a bus accident into a river, 2 separate car fires, a vehicle explosion, being struck by a bus, and a head-on collision on a mountain road that launched him out of his car and into a tree while his vehicle plunged hundreds of feet below. Any one of these incidents should have killed him, but he walked away from all of them. And if his survival streak wasn't incredible enough, when he turned 73, he won the lottery, over $1 million. His life has been described as a bizarre combination of tragedy, miracles, and cosmic mischief. These stories of freezing bodies revived, of surviving the highest falls ever recorded, of escaping lightning again and again, of enduring war, shark attacks, train accidents, jungle crashes, firing squads, and more, remind us that the line between life and death is sometimes far more flexible than we imagine. Human resilience isn't just a concept, it's a force. And for some people, it's powerful enough to bend the rules of nature. If you enjoyed this deep dive into unbelievable survival stories, make sure you subscribe. We explore the most extraordinary real events, strange human experiences, and the stories that push the limits of what we think is possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.